Welcome to this video on reading strategies, which is part of our critical reading series. There are 4 videos in this series, so please be sure to watch all of them. Reading in academic context is a literacy that needs to be mastered to be a successful writer. Almost all academic tasks rely on reading. Completing a dissertation often requires extensive reading. And even though you might be an excellent reader of novels or technical texts, you might still find reading in academic texts difficult, in the beginning particularly. As you get more used to it, you'll find it easier and easier. So Wang, in a study of students in 2009 in the US, found that only 55% of students, both native and non-native speakers of English, could identify explicitly stated main ideas in a text. 42% could understand main ideas that were implicit, and only 11% knew a global idea in the text. The study also showed that students found it difficult to write a summary statement. And this indicates that academic reading is often complex and something we have to work on. You know, we often think if we've read an article once, we should be able to understand it. But in academic context, we often need to return to it and spend time working out the meaning. If the article is very dense, we may need to read it paragraph by paragraph and work out the meaning in each section. Reading is dependent on 2 processes, the ability to understand the language and the ability to decode meaning. Understanding the language and decoding meaning in a discourse or disciplined community seems straightforward, but language becomes very specialized in these communities, and sometimes it can be quite complex. Research texts are often difficult to decipher because of the depth of intertextuality. Intertextuality is the multiple layers of text that the current text draws on. So have a look at this meme. In the meme, there are 2 texts at work. The explicit message, everything you learned about writing in high school was a lie. And the implicit message, the revealing of a secret, what if I told you? The intertextual reference is to the film The Matrix. Now, if you've seen the film, you'll be able to read much more into the explicit message. If you haven't seen the film, you won't be able to access the additional meaning. If you look closely in the reflected glasses, there is a threatening subtext to this image. All of these layers produce messages that can be read if we understand the intertextual layers. Academic papers are full of intertextual references. If you understand the references, then these texts become easier to read. If not, it can be difficult to decipher meaning. And over time, as you begin to read more and more, so you begin to decipher more and more meaning. But here's an example of a paper that many of you, I'm sure, have come across. And I'm going to just read the paragraph. In turning our attention to writing as governmentality, we are interested in the way academic writing may both contain and constrain, and lead into the not yet known, to that which exceeds that which constrains it. Foucault describes his own writing as excess, as going beyond what he knows when he asks, if you knew when you began a book what you would say at the end, do you think you would have the courage to write it? Going beyond the already known can take a certain kind of courage, a willingness to be found inappropriate, unrecognizable. Writing may take us to the not yet known, but it is also at the same time an inscription and a performance of ourselves, through available repertoires of meaning-making, through which we make sense, or fail to make sense. In writing into the space of the blank page, we enter a place of production of the subject. Writing is, as Foucault points out, one of the key technologies of the self. Writing in our working lives inscribes us into a place as academic selves, as recognizable and legitimate subjects within the circuits of exchange and value, within and between universities. So what I've done in this piece is to highlight some of the concepts that have huge bodies of literature attached to them. You could take courses on each of those highlighted concepts that I've drawn your attention to in this example. So the passage contains concepts that draw on large bodies of literature. To understand this particular passage, you would at least need to know something about this literature. So most disciplines become specialized and rely on readers knowing these many layers of meaning. And that's why it's often difficult for someone outside of the discipline to understand the writing. Another reason why academic texts are hard to read is because of reading purpose. There are multiple reasons for reading an academic text. You may read a novel just for enjoyment or read a newspaper to be informed, but academic texts can be read for a number of different reasons. You could read the text for information. For example, when I used the citation Wang, and I cited the number of students who could understand a text, the main idea of a text, I was providing information there for you, and I'm building an argument that students find it difficult to read. You might also read for the purpose of finding out the overall message. So you might not be interested in the details of the methodology or anything else. You just want the message that the paper's providing. And an example of this would be the Perrin citation, the ability to understand language and the ability to decode meaning. That was the key message of that particular paper, and that's all I used it for. So I read it for that purpose. You might also read for theoretical insight. So here you're only looking at how this particular author has articulated a theory or a conceptual framework or a model. You might read for research methods. And this is where, perhaps if you're new to a field and you're thinking about doing research in a particular field, you would read how people have conducted research in that field so that you can assess what ways have been successful and what methods have not been so successful. So then your purpose is reading for the research methods. You might also read to critique, and here you want to see if you are convinced by the arguments and the research. So is this a paper that I'm going to align myself with? Or is this a paper that I'm going to use as a counter argument? So when you're reading for critique, you are looking to see whether or not the source text aligns with your thinking. Now, there are many other ways of reading academic texts. I've just taken you through some of the most common. But most reading in academic context involves an intellectual labor. It requires work. And it's always much more difficult at the beginning of a program, and as you begin reading, it becomes easier and easier. I want to go through some approaches to reading now. There are many approaches to reading. I'm just going to highlight 3. The first approach is the slow and steady approach. This is where you begin with a key article. You read that article carefully. You go through the sources. You look up relevant references cited by this author. You move on to another article and you repeat the process. The advantage is that it's systematic and thorough. The disadvantage is that it's slow and you'll read a lot of material that may not be relevant. The Blitz approach, what I've called the Blitz approach, is a global approach, and really it's about searching and then reading. So what you would do is develop keywords, carefully develop keywords, and then search library databases or on the internet quite systematically, collecting articles based on reading the abstracts only. And then once you would read the abstract, decide if you wanted to keep it, download it to a folder, and read it later. You might do some sorting and grouping into themes, deciding which articles are really important, and then read those. The advantage of this is that you get a global view of the literature and your reading becomes focused because you're only reading those articles you've identified as important. The disadvantage is that you can spend a lot of time searching, so you need to set a time limit so that you're not downloading millions of articles to read. A targeted approach is where you choose one author's works, or you search through one journal, well-known journal, or you might decide on a concept and search that concept. But you're targeting the approach. You might set a time limit within which to search. So you are being very focused in your search. You might change your strategy depending on what you're trying to do. Reading slowly to understand theoretical approaches, for example, and taking a more global approach when you want to get a feel for the literature in a new area. These are just some ideas to give you, just some strategies to begin. What we're going to move on to now are strategies for reading journal articles. And what I would always begin with is understanding how journal articles are written. Most journal articles follow a very similar structure. And if you understand that, it becomes easier to read. So most research articles have the following components: an abstract, which is a summary of the text, an introduction, which includes a background to the research problem and context, the literature review, which outlines the research, key debates, and the knowledge gap. The knowledge gap that this research will fill, the methodology, the decisions made to conduct research, the step-by-step process of collecting and analyzing the data, the results, where you would find the presentation of findings, the discussion, where the findings are taken back to the literature, and synthesis between the results and the literature has happened, and conclusions, which identifies the main kind of message of the study. Now, in other fields like sciences or engineering, the research article might look slightly different. An abstract, an introduction, which would include a literature review. There might not be a separate literature review. A methods and materials section, where the focus is more on the materials and possibly less on the methods, depending on your field. A results section, a discussion section, and a conclusion section. So sometimes, depending on the field, the structure is slightly different. If you are in the humanities or philosophy, then you may not have a method or methodology section, and your paper may rely more heavily on argument. So you need to look out for that. But understanding how a paper is structured can really help you to read it. So another method or another reading strategy is analyzing the methodology of a text, particularly research articles, empirically based research articles. Look specifically at the methodology. Was primary data collected? If so, what was the method? What were the data collection steps? How was the data analyzed? If the paper was based on secondary sources, published material, what are those sources? How recent? How has the author used those sources to support an argument? So looking at the primary data can be a way into that paper. Another strategy would be analyzing the research outcomes of the text. So here you're focusing on the results. So you would need to go back to the research problem to understand the results and the context of the research. But the focus is what are the main conclusions of this research. Let's move on to a process for reading journal articles. So what I would suggest is that in your first read, you read the abstract only, or abstract and headings. And really what you're doing is you're getting a sense of the paper. Where is the author based? What is the paper about? What is the paper's main contributions? Is this paper relevant for my project? Then in the second read, take a closer look at the introduction and conclusion, look at the references, and you're looking for what are the paper's main contributions, what theoretical conceptual base was used to frame the findings, who is the author citing. And then move into an in-depth reading and read the text as a whole, including figures and tables, and what you're looking for are assumptions valid, what questions do I have, how can I use this in my research. A strategy, if a text is very dense and difficult to decipher, is to read the text paragraph by paragraph. For each paragraph, try to write a sentence or two that captures the meaning of that paragraph to the best of your ability. And at the end of the paper, you'll have a summary of the paper. You can then take that summary back and read the paper again and see if it makes more sense. In this video, we've looked at the different purposes for reading academic texts, different approaches, slow and steady, the Blitz or global approach, a targeted approach. We've looked at strategies for reading, understanding journal structures, focusing on methodologies, focusing on the outcomes of the research. We've looked at a 3-round process for reading and a strategy for reading a difficult paper. Pause the video if you want to look at these references in more detail. And thank you very much for watching this video on reading strategies. We have 3 more videos in this series, so please be sure to watch them. And best of luck with your reading.